Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sesotris. It is Monday, and this week I wanted to talk about reading books in translation. This isn't really something that normal folks deal with on a daily basis, but if you're a bookish person, then... Oh, here comes Circe. Yep. She has a lot of opinions about this. If you're a bookish person, this is something you'll probably encounter more than once. Now, the big question with translations is, which is the best translation? How do you find a translation that works? What's the difference between different translations? And so on. And so I kind of wanted to do a general, vague run-through of kind of what that is in a very general sense. So this is going to be really slapdash and covering a lot of ground, so just bear with me. So if you're dealing with a recent book, or fairly recent book, there's probably only ever going to be like one translation into your language. A good example is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson, and was originally written in Swedish, and it was published in the English translation by Stephen T. Murray in 2008. And so the original Swedish edition, the title is, and I'm going to mangle this thing, but it's Men som hater kvinnor, which is like men who hate women. And then it was translated into English as The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And so there's only kind of one English translation of this. You don't have to go searching for multiple translations. Now, there are going to be translations into different languages. For example, this one here, this is a Norwegian translation of the book. I found this in a used bookstore, and I thought it was the original Swedish, and I was really excited, but it's Norwegian, and they're very similar. There's like a few letters different in the title, but this is Norwegian, not Swedish. And so, like, there's probably one Norwegian translation of the Swedish book also. But there's not going to be like multiple translations that you have to go questing for. Now, if a book is older, then sometimes there are going to be multiple translations. And so you do have to pore through them and see which would be the best option. So when you're dealing with an older translation, there's like three things you should kind of be asking yourself. First off, does the translator take any liberties with the source material? I'm reminded of the very famous case of the Icelandic translation of Dracula by Valdemar Osmundsson, I think his name was. And the name of the translation was Macht Mercana, and I think I pronounced that terribly, but basically it's like Powers of Darkness. And the translation changed so much. It changed like character names and settings, and it used elements from Icelandic mythology and all that kind of stuff. And so everyone was just kind of like, oh yeah, that's the, Icelandic translation. But then when someone actually translated it back into English, they discovered that it was almost like unrecognizable, like a totally different thing. So I've heard it's good, but yeah, it's not Dracula. It's totally different. So there are some translators that will take liberties with the source material. Another example is Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Iliad. Book 10 in that one is sometimes believed to be added later, so it's not like part of the original text, but was kind of added in later. But most translations will just leave that book in because it's an oral tradition and things were added and taken away, and so it's fine. But Stephen Mitchell's translation removes that book and adds it into an appendix at the end, and so there's kind of questions, like that's one of the things that makes that particular translation sort of controversial, is because he's like removed something, even though he removed it because he wanted to stick to kind of stuff that was original to the story. But anyways, so sometimes translators will take liberties. I know sometimes like the second or third translation of like Les Mis removed some sections and abridged it in the translation process. And so you want to be aware of, if it's a translation, is it abridging anything of the original? Is it removing anything? Is it changing anything? And then you kind of go from there. The other thing to be on the lookout for is, does the translator capture like the flow and cadence of the original language? Because sometimes translation is more an act of poetry than it is an act of scholarship. And so when you're translating something, you really want to be aware of how the original was meant to kind of flow, and in terms of like pacing, but also in terms of just the flow of the words. And so there's some translations that really capture the feel of the original language really well. There are some that modify kind of the cadence of the original language to suit the language it's translating into. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that doesn't work. And the third thing is just, is it readable and engaging? There's some translations that are very slavish to kind of the original text, to the point of just like word for word literal translation. And sometimes that can make it feel very awkward in the language that it's translating it into. And so you want to be aware of how well it's just readable to the audience. Okay, so for an example of an older book, I'm going to use Victor Hugo's Les Misérables. Now, there was a bunch of different translations, and there's some, like the second one, the second English translation, there were some revisions and changes and such that weren't super great. But there's a couple modern translations, or modern-ish, that we have floating around. And so the question is sort of, which is the best? And this is going to be kind of up to the reader, but there's two different translations that I wanted to compare. So Victor Hugo wrote this in 1862, and the first English translation in America and in England were kind of later on that same year. In 1887, Isabel Florence Hapgood did a new translation that's a pretty common one to find. It's the one that's on Project Gutenberg. It's the version that I listened to in like the audiobook. The first version that I read was through audio. And it's a pretty good translation. It's serviceable. It's clear, it's understandable, and there was kind of no issues. But then I found another translation by Christine, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but I think it's Donahue or Donaher, and that's the Penguin version. And this translation is excellent. It moves with a flow and a pace that the other one didn't, and I think it kind of captures the reader a lot more. And so I wanted to show two different passages, like the same passage in these two different translations, so you can kind of see what I mean. So the first one is from the Hapgood translation, and this is from Part 4, Book 1, Chapter 1. The chapter starts, 1831 and 1832, the 2 years which are immediately connected with the Revolution of July, form one of the most peculiar and striking moments of history. And now for the Donahue translation. The 2 years immediately following the July Revolution, 1831 and 1832, stand out as one of history's most distinctive and striking moments. So you can see that the two translations, they both say the same things. The syntax is a little bit different, but the first one feels very passive. It's very kind of passive voice, very academic sounding. And the second one feels more like a novel. It propels itself forward. It rearranges the sentence a little bit so that it kind of moves at a better pace. And the emphasis is placed more on sort of action. And I think it just works better. And so that is my current favorite translation. There are some others. I know there's one translation by, I think it's Julie Rose. And it kind of attempts to modernize things a little bit. Like, it uses modern slang like greasy spoon to describe the Thénardiers. And it's fine. It's engaging, and if it gets people reading it, then that's fine. But it kind of tries too hard to sort of modernize things. But when you're looking for translation, the big thing is just, do you enjoy it? Does it make you want to keep reading? The Hapgood translation, I listened to that in audio. The narrator was really good, and so I just really enjoyed it, and I kind of fell into it. But this translation, the Donahue translation. That one, it's just so much better. It just moves with a pace that just kind of drags you in a lot more. So I really like that one a lot more. So if you're thinking about sort of the best translation of Les Mis, it's more which one clicks with your brain more, but I definitely suggest the Penguin version. Now there are some editions of it that translate the title, because this is another thing with translation. The title, like we saw with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the title can sometimes be totally different. So in French, it's Les Misérables. In some editions of that translation, the title is translated to be like The Wretched, which just sounds ridiculous. And I know that's a passable translation of it, but it just doesn't work. I feel like this is one where like the original French title works the best. Now there's other books by him, such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where the English translated title is sort of more popular than the French title. So in French, it's Notre Dame de Paris, and the word hunchback isn't even mentioned. And so the English translation of it is, you know, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is, I don't know, I think more romantic, and it's more evocative and everything, even though Quasimodo isn't necessarily a main character in the book, he's more like the catalyst that everything else kind of moves around. But anyways, so if you see it titled The Wretched, it is Les Mis. It's just, it's a translated title. For a long time, it was published as a bunch of different things. It was like The Dispossessed, or The Wretched Ones, or The Miserable, and it was just kind of all over the place. So I think we have, you know, the musical version to thank for kind of locking in Les Misérables as the official title forever. And so now we're going to move to poetry, specifically epic poetry, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of people experience translated works through. So like the Odyssey, the Iliad, Beowulf, the Divine Comedy, those are all translated works. And when it comes to poetry, the translator's work becomes so much more difficult, because when you're translating a novel, you do have kind of the structure baked in. You know, you can kind of decide how to word sentences, but the sentences are usually kind of in the same order, and for the most part, not a whole lot changes in terms of like the structure of the book itself. You're not going to really do anything with that. But when it comes to epic poetry, you have to be aware of the flow of the original language, and you have to change a lot of stuff to make it work in the language you're translating it into. So for something like the Divine Comedy, Italian has a very specific, medieval Italian in this case, has a very specific flow, and there's lots of specific rhymes and rhythms that won't work if you translate it into English. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in both capturing the essence of the original while making it clear and understandable. And so I wanted to use Homer's Odyssey as an example because I love it so much, and we have a ton of translations of this one. And so the differences between versions are sometimes really startling, because you've got the original text, which, it's funny, the language that Homer wrote in is just called Homeric Greek. And so it's not even like just ancient Greek, the same as like, you know, Oedipus Rex. It's like its own thing, and it's a very kind of idiosyncratic version of ancient Greek. And so there's kind of a lot of work that has to go into doing a translation of that. And so I wanted to look at the beginning of the Odyssey, the first couple lines, and compare 4 different translations, because each one is really, really different. The first 2 are from the 30s. The first one's poetry, the second one is prose, and then there's 2 translations that are much, much more modern, one from, I think, 2013 and 2018. And so we get to see kind of how the translator's job in capturing both like the text, but also the feel of it and the rhythm of it and what they do with it, I think is really interesting. So here's 4 examples, and then we'll go from there. So the first example is by T.E. Lawrence from 1932, and this is the first line. O divine Posy, goddess daughter of Zeus, sustain for me the song of the various-minded man, who after he had plundered the innermost citadel of hallowed Troy, was made to stay grievously about the coasts of men, the sport of their customs, good or bad, while his heart through all the seafaring ached in an agony to redeem himself and bring his company safe home. So this one is very poetic. It feels a little stuffy, but it's kind of that elevated declamatory language, kind of trying to get at to kind of the grandeur of the Greek origin. So the next one is by W.H.D. Rouse, and this translation is a prose translation that was written a few years later in 1937. And this one is meant to be kind of accessible. It's aimed at kind of a younger audience, so this is how it starts. This is the story of a man, one who was never at a loss. He had traveled far in the world after the sack of Troy, the virgin fortress. He saw many cities of men and learnt their mind. He endured many troubles and hardships in the struggle to save his own life and to bring back his men safe to their homes. So this one, it's passable, it's understandable, it's clear, but it doesn't have the same kind of flowery filigree that the first version did. But I do like that version. And that's this one here, the Signet Classics version. So next up, I'm going to read the Stephen Mitchell translation. This is more recent. This is 2013 when this was published. Yes, 2013. And I really like his translation. It's kind of a good middle ground between kind of readable and simple and kind of flowery and epic. So this is how that one begins. Sing to me, muse, of that endlessly cunning man who was blown off course to the ends of the earth in the years after he plundered Troy. He passed through the cities of many people and learned how they thought, and he suffered many bitter hardships upon the high seas as he tried to save his own life and bring his companions back to their home. I really like this one because it's clear, but it's also, it has kind of a rhythm and a bounce to it that is really engaging, and I really like the way that he kind of propels the story forward. Oh, here's Circe again. Yes, I know. And so finally, I wanted to read a section from Emily Wilson's translation, which is probably my favorite. This was published in 2018, and she has a new translation of the Iliad coming out next month, and I'm so excited for it. This one is a little bit different. This one strips it down a little bit, and it goes for kind of elegant simplicity while still maintaining that kind of poetic, beautiful kind of flow. I love the way this one's very focused on character, and I love the way this one portrays Telemachus, Odysseus, and Circe, and all those other characters, because it finds, I don't know, humanity in kind of everyone. No one really becomes like a cardboard cutout, and it really feels alive. So this is how this translation starts. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and when he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. This one has a really great rhythm to it. I love the way it moves and flows. So if you're looking for kind of the best translation of something like the Odyssey, it really is up to you. When it comes to academics, they can't agree on anything. There's two versions of King Lear in Shakespeare's canon. There's like the history of King Lear and the tragedy of King Lear. And there's a conflated version where it kind of meshes the two together in kind of a quest to kind of create the original King Lear. But you're always going to have academics arguing about which version is the best. So when it comes to translations like this, it's just read the first little bit, and the one that keeps you entertained the longest is probably the one you should go with. There's older, stuffier translations. I know the Iliad has a translation by James Lattimore, I think is the translator, and that one is very old school. It's a little stuffier, but it feels very grand and sweeping, and so it's always fun to compare translations. But if you just want to read it just to enjoy it, which I think is the purpose of literature, just find a translation that captures your attention. I know when it comes to the Odyssey, another translation that's really well beloved is the Fagles translation, which oddly I don't, yes, I know, oddly I don't have that one. I'm still questing for that one. For some reason it used to be available everywhere, and now I can't find it. So, who knows? Yeah, I know. But, so, she's distracting me. So when it comes to translation, there is no right or wrong answer. There's no like bad translation. If you talk to like message boards in like literature circles or like literature Facebook groups or whatever, you're definitely going to get lots of people who are like, that's the worst translation ever and you're a bad person if you read it. But honestly, just enjoy what you enjoy. Find a translation that works for you and just kind of go with it, because everyone has different tastes and there's no one size fits all. But I will say, tend to avoid translations that edit the original too much or kind of take too many liberties with the source material. But with that, I'll let you go. Enjoy what you want, read what you want, and have fun. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.